So who's my guest this week? It's the Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband. Nearly 80 million people were forced to flee their homes last year, and that was before Russia invaded Ukraine, fueling a growing global food crisis. Founded at the request of Albert Einstein in the 1930s, the International Rescue Committee helps resettle and educate refugees, treading a path between policy, politics, populism and people, not always a conducive mix. Its president and CEO also knows both government and non-governmental power as a former British Foreign Secretary. From Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan and South Sudan to the US border and the English Channel, how can NGOs act in the best interests of refugees while navigating governments with competing priorities? Here's what's coming up. Is it frustrating the lack of awareness and understanding people have about displaced people around the world as well?
Well, I think that the scenes from Ukraine, they've created in everyone that visceral sense, it could be me. That's a fundamental mind shift for people.
Do you want to get back into politics?
I'm running a $1.4 billion NGO. We are in the middle of the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War, and I feel genuinely lucky to be doing this job.
David, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I thought we'd start with, of course, what you focus on, which is displaced people. And just looking at the numbers, 80 million displaced people, now Ukraine plus a global food crisis. We've hit 100 million displaced people, according to the UNRC, this year. And I wondered, from your vantage point, what are you most concerned about with those sorts of numbers?
So I run an international humanitarian organisation, the International Rescue Committee, with this extraordinary heritage. It was founded by Albert Einstein to rescue people from Europe. Today, we work in 35 countries that are either in conflict, so places like Somalia or parts of Ethiopia, parts of Syria, or places that are hosting what you call rightly the displaced. Mm-hmm. And just to be absolutely clear, these are people who are forced to flee their homes by violence and by persecution and by disaster. So we're not talking about economic migration here, we're talking about people who are victims of conflict and disaster. And the places that we're most worried about are those either that are in the front line, so the east of Ukraine is a classic example, parts of Ethiopia today. There's fortunately a ceasefire in Yemen, so there's less immediate threat to life and limb there. The Afghan conflict is over. But the places where there isn't a raging conflict but have recently been in conflict, there's frankly not just food insecurity, hunger, there's the real threat of mass famine. So the Horn of Africa,
yes.
The Sahel region of Africa, Afghanistan, where 97% of the population, it seems almost incredible, but these are official UN figures, are living in poverty. Yemen, 17 million people dependent on the World Food Programme, essentially, for support. I'm worried that literally we're facing a life and death situation in conflict zones, but also in places that aren't in conflict, but where the combination of the after effects of conflict on farming, the impact of the rise in food prices, the impact of the rise in energy prices, means that people are really on the brink, even before you begin to think about humanitarian help for health, for education, for livelihoods.
Okay, because I suppose you're right that people's minds stay focused at the point of conflict, don't they? And then they don't know very much, perhaps, about what happens next and those points
well,
where
there are
the stress is.
53 different civil conflicts going on around the world at the moment.
Is it 53? Right?
Yeah, and the diplomacy doesn't work because we know diplomacy as sorting out relations between states. These are 53 conflicts within states.
Yes.
And that's where the displacement is coming from these days. And in post-conflict societies, like Afghanistan, the danger is that conflict returns. And so we're dealing with a cycle now that we can identify the problem. It's much harder to get to the solutions. But what we try and do as an NGO, as a non-governmental organization, is focus on helping people survive, recover, and gain control of their lives.
Yeah, I mean, just on what's happened with Ukraine and where attention has been focused, do you feel, or what's that like when you're looking across the whole picture with your teams around the world? to see how much attention then suddenly goes elsewhere. And there were concerns, and I wanted to get your take on this, that perhaps with Ukraine, more sympathy, more attention went there because, you know, as some put it, those people, certainly in the West, felt like they were relatable. They were like us.
Yes, I think it's undoubtedly the case that a war on the continent of Europe brings out a response, especially among Europeans, that is visceral in a way that is different than if it's in Afghanistan or Syria or further away. And I think there are two aspects of the response to the Ukraine crisis that are very striking. One, which you were hinting at, isn't Ukraine better funded than everywhere else? And the short answer to that is yes.
Is it?
Yes, it is 4, 5, 6, 7 times as much per head as in Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen. And I think that it's really important to try and say that Ukraine should set a standard for the level of help that people should have if they are the victims of conflict and are on the run. And that help isn't just financial help. The European Union pledged to every Ukrainian 3 years residency, 3 years right to work, 3 years access to education in schools. That's not available to most refugees in most places. Now, the second thing that's different is that in the Ukraine crisis, refugees have fled to a rich part of the world. I mean, even Poland is one of the poorer countries in Europe, but it's rich by global standards. Most refugees and displaced people in the 100 million figure that has been quoted by the UN, most of them are in poor countries, not in rich countries. They're more likely to be in Uganda, Ethiopia, Lebanon, Bangladesh than they are in Poland, the UK, or the US.
So it places strain where there's already strain in a system.
Yes, and it's also a site of responsibility that is not being fulfilled. So essentially the myth in richer countries that they're bearing the greatest burden isn't true, and the fact that it's poorer countries that are being expected to bear this responsibility is not leading to the kind of responsibility sharing that people like me would argue for.
So on that argument that you make, you know, beyond, I suppose, your funding and where the money that you get goes, and you talk about it not being handouts, trying to be an empowering view of this, with those facts of the majority of those people going to poorer countries, what isn't being done that should be done?
Well, look, 3% of the global humanitarian budget goes on education, but half of the displaced are children. So swathes of displaced people who are refugees or internally displaced are getting no education at all.
So is that about allocating the money better that already exists in the system,
no,
or boosting?
Funds.
You've got to grow that
UN runs appeals for countries in crisis, and they are 20% funded, 25% funded. So there's significant underfunding, even though the funding has doubled more or less in the last decade. Why is there underfunding? Because the needs have trebled in the last decade.
Right.
Essentially, the number of displaced people has trebled, the amount of funding has doubled, and it started from a point that was too low. So education is massively under-invested. 60% of maternal deaths in childbirth are in fragile and conflict states from which people are fleeing. And 45% of kids who die in the first month of life are in fragile and conflict states. So there's massive health needs that are not being met. Never mind the fact that only 3% of the world's refugees go home every year, end up going home.
3%. Okay.
3%. So there aren't sustainable solutions. Most refugees are not in camps, but those that are end up spending 10, 20, 30 years there, even though it was set up as a temporary camp. Those that are in urban areas, 60% of refugees are in urban areas. They have the opportunities that exist in urban areas, economic opportunities, but also all the risks of child trafficking and the rest of it.
So is that now, if you're talking about, especially just because it all goes back to funding, I mean, it's not all that, but it helps everything else go. Are you then saying particular countries have to put their hand in the pocket a lot more? Or are you talking about, I don't know, a completely different way of doing this and funding it?
Well, I think that there's no question that the richer countries, I mean, we're talking in London, the UK's cut its overseas aid budget, despite the fact that needs are growing. And there's only 2 or 3 countries in the world that meet the UN's target that 0.7% of national income for richer countries should go towards development aid. And that development aid needs increasingly to be on fragile and conflict states, because now more or less half of the world's extreme poor are not in the Indias and Chinas of this world. There are more extreme poor in Nigeria than there are in India, even though the population of India is 4 times that of Nigeria.
So bigger, yeah.
And the reason is that conflict is the great driver of extreme poverty today. When you combine conflict with COVID and with the climate crisis, that's how you get the kind of storm that pushes people into the famine conditions that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation.
So if you got all of the rich countries to get to that level, to the 0.7%, I mean, the British government's talked about restoring that, and it was COVID and it was temporary, but putting aside, if you like, one country, if you got all of the countries to do that, would it tally up?
Well, it would tally up in treating the symptoms. But when I tell you there are 53 conflicts in the world, the only way to really address the root causes is to tackle the roots of conflict. I mean, the reason people are fleeing is that conflict is untamed. And it's untamed because the world doesn't have good diplomatic tools for tackling conflicts within states. It's got much better, notwithstanding Ukraine.
But is that because of a worldview that, sorry to cut across, but because there's this idea that countries should be left to deal with their own internal issues?
There's a significant part of the issue is the sovereignty argument, that what goes on within a state is only the business of that state. So if we choose to bomb our own citizens, as some states do, if we choose to deny aid to our own citizens, that's only our business. Second part of it, though, is in a weird way the opposite. So our analysis is that sovereignty is being used as a shield against accountability by governments. But secondly, there's a massive growth in the number of what are called internationalized conflicts. If you look at Libya, or you look at Syria, or you look at even Ethiopia, there's external interference. 6, 10, 12 different countries, Yemen, 12 different countries involved with proxies or other support. So on the one hand, it's the sovereignty argument used to keep the international system out, to keep UN officials out. On the other hand, internationalization of conflict is driving the kind of impunity that we're seeing that's driving more people to flee.
But we've got no appetite in some ways at the same time, do we, for intervention? I know what you just said about the outside forces, but there's this kind of thing coming together at the same time. And you've been a foreign secretary for this country, for the UK, and you will have seen how it works at a state level. So how do you deal with that in a climate of, especially, I mean, you even see it, of course, America. You know, I was talking to John Bolton, the former security advisor to Trump on this programme only a few weeks ago, and he says Biden is just not doing enough to arm Ukraine. You know, even at arm's length, there is a concern because we don't want to get involved. So I know you're talking about diplomacy as opposed to arming, but there is an appetite, there's a lack of appetite for getting involved, isn't there?
Well, I think there is. I think you're right. And that partly explains the weakness of the multilateral system. But I would argue that if these problems aren't tackled, you end up with more political instability that in a connected world ends up rebounding on you.
But so how do you change it?
Well, I think you have to argue for it. You have to win the political argument.
But why is somebody like Joe Biden not winning it then? He said, we're back.
Yes.
And is he back?
Well, I think he's back in some aspects of the international system, but in others he's blocked. And there are two blockages. One blockage is public opinion, which doesn't want him to be spending his time on foreign matters. Second, on something like COVID, where he promised leadership, Congress has denied him a penny of extra international funding. So he's got one hand tied behind his back, which in a way reflects the domestic politics. Look, my perspective on this is that the West is in retreat for some reasons which are understandable to do with domestic pressure. And there's vacuum in a lot of places. That's the vacuum that tempted President Putin to invade Ukraine, the vacuum that leaves the Syria situation 10 years on. It's alongside Ukraine, the biggest refugee crisis. There are two frozen conflicts inside Syria now, in the northwest and the northeast, where we have teams of people working, but it's not part of, there's no active diplomatic process to resolve that.
And whose fault is that?
Well, I think the vacuum was created by Western retreat, and a range of different actors have moved in to take the place.
A recent policy of the UK's with the intention to deter people from crossing the English Channel, you'll be very familiar with this, to enter the UK illegally, has been to deport them to Rwanda. At the time we're talking, no one has been, because lawyers got involved and there were human rights issues and challenges that have been successful so far. If you look at the polling on it so far, it is not an insignificant number of people who support it. I'm not saying it's not the majority who do support it, but it's not insignificant. What do you say to those people who support that, who think that is the solution for people, stopping people from making a very dangerous journey?
Well, one, they've been told that the processing of the asylum claim will be done in Rwanda. That's not true. Your word, they are deported to Rwanda, is actually true, because even if they pass the asylum claim, they have to stay in Rwanda. Secondly, it's not true to say that there's no alternative to deporting people to Rwanda if you want to manage asylum flows. Other countries show how you manage asylum flows by running an effective asylum system. Thirdly, having left the European Union, Britain has lost the right to send back to the continent of Europe people who fail their asylum claim, which we had when we were members of the European Union. No British asylum policy can work unless it works with France. It stands to reason because geography hasn't been ended by our departure from the European Union. So there are alternatives to this policy. That's what I would say to the people who are tempted by this policy. You can also find...
It sounds like you feel like they've been lied to, though.
Well, there's no question that they've been... It was missold. It was avowedly missold as external processing of asylum claims rather than actually the deportation of asylum seekers, whether or not they pass the test.
But for those who want something to deter, so rather than... I know what you're talking about, the alternatives, but they think that something to stop people getting in those dinghies in the first place, because they've reached France, they've reached safety compared to where they've come from. What would you say to that?
I'd say to them, did you know that the policy says there will be no deportation of children and pregnant women? So there is an incentive for every people smuggler to say to a pregnant woman or to a child, we'll get you across. It's incentivizing the people smuggling of unaccompanied children rather than disincentivizing it. And I've also can trade polls of 77, 80% of British people who say that if people have a legitimate reason to fear going back to their own country, they should be given refuge in this country. So in the end, it's not about trading.
Also, I was just going to say, of the people who come, the majority do get the right to stay.
Well, that's a very good point. 70, 80, 90%, depending whether they're from Syria, Afghanistan or Yemen, pass the asylum test.
That threshold,
yes.
Even without those routes that you're talking about, which could be an alternative to set up a proper process so they don't have to come in that way or feel that they have to come. I suppose it's just other countries are also considering this. Denmark's looking at it. Rwanda are obviously in the government, not the opposition. They're saying, we're a great country, come. I mean, there's this idea, there's an uncomfortableness around many parts of this. But why are other countries also looking at it?
Well, because they're looking at the numbers and they're seeing that there might be some political advantage in trying to sell the idea that this is a quote-unquote deterrent. As I've tried to explain, it's not a deterrent.
So the deterrent bit won't work, is your point, so we need to do something else.
We know it won't work because we've seen it in other places. The push factors that are driving people out of countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, etc., are so strong that that aspect of the deterrence is not going to work. What I think does behoove really serious attention is that at the moment there isn't a legal route to claim asylum if you're at the moment in Afghanistan.
Which I think a lot of people don't know, as a fact about the UK, for instance.
Yes.
That they will not necessarily know that.
No.
There is I suppose from your perspective, is it frustrating the lack of awareness and understanding people have about displaced people around the world as well?
Well, I think that the scenes from Ukraine, for all that they can be criticised as giving greater attention than for refugees from other places, they've created in everyone that visceral sense, it could be me. You pack your bag, you say goodbye to your husband or your brother or your father who's going off to fight, and you leave. That's a fundamental mind shift for people.
So Ukraine may have woken people back up.
I think it has woken people up. We know that from the number of people who are volunteering to have Ukrainians come and stay in their house. We know that from donations to charities. We know that from the overall public opinion surveys. But what we also know is that if countries don't step up together, then resentment breeds. People say, well, if people in Germany said, well, we've taken 1 million Syrians, what did France do? Not very much by comparison. So you've got to step up together.
Do you want to get back into politics?
I'm running a $1.4 billion NGO. We are in the middle of the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. And I feel genuinely lucky to be doing this job. I was in politics. I'm an ex-politician. All sorts of things can happen to you after you leave politics. I've found something that allows me to put my values into action. I feel inspired by the way in which we've made solutions, not suffering, the calling card of the International Rescue Committee. We've grown from being a $400 million organisation to being a $1.4 billion organisation. And we've got to take the lessons of our solutions to health and to hunger and to lack of education and take them to a wider audience. I always say to people that I don't know what I'm going to do next. And that may not be a satisfying answer, but it's an honest answer.
You will be still a keen watcher of UK politics. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about, are you still a member of the Labour Party, of the left? Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. there are people who are very frustrated by his leadership when there have been what they would say open goals on the Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, with issues around him being fined by the police through to other trust issues. Do you share those frustrations?
Well, I am, as a British citizen, I am much more frustrated by the policies of the British government than I am by the performance of the Labour opposition. The country faces massive challenges.
Yes.
Post-austerity,
eye-catching
post-Brexit, post-COVID, post the war in Ukraine and all that's done to energy prices. And it's not being given answers by the right in politics, and it needs to be given some answers by the centre-left in politics. And the judgment in the end has got to be, how is it going to change the country? We're 25 years since the 97 Labour election victory, which I was involved with. 21 years since the 2001, 17 years since 2005, the 3 elections that we won on the trot. We won on the trot by presenting a clear project to the country where, agree with it or disagree with it, you knew what it was about, and then there were policies to emblemise and to symbolise the change that was being promised. That is the task that Keir Starmer has said that he has.
Do you think we'll have a Prime Minister Starmer?
Yes, I think there's a real chance of that. I think he's got depth and breadth that is important. And anyone who tells you, yeah, it's certain, it's 100% chance that that's not the real world. That's partisanship, not prediction. But I think he's a serious person with a real understanding of how to lead and a real sense of where the country's going wrong. And he's got to bring that out and take it to the British people.
Has he asked for your advice?
He's got tons of advice.
Well, your brother's in the shadow cabinet.
He's got tons of advice. He doesn't need, I'm sure he's watching this programme and can.
Well, we'll make sure. We'll make sure. No, but when people have been through things, they can reach out to others who have been through them. And I was also just wanted to bring up before our time was over that you took Hillary Clinton for a fish and chip dinner, I believe, very recently.
More than one chip, I can report.
Good, many chips.
Fish and chips.
Does she have vinegar?
She in the great vinegar versus no vinegar divide, she took vinegar. She also took tartar sauce, and she also ate mushy peas without confusing them with avocado puree. Which, for those of your viewers who are acute followers of British politics, will know that it's a very significant.
This was in South Shields.
In South Shields, which is my former constituency.
Your former political home, and you've taken quite a few world leaders and dignitaries around that place, and you always go to the same fish and chips.
Correct. Sustainable.
Coleman's
Fish and Chip Shop on the Ocean Road.
Okay, and so it sounds like she enjoyed it. But I wonder, as 2 former politicians, have you discussed, life beyond and what it's like to be out of it now? Have you?
Yes, of course. And look, she did me a great honour in coming to South Shields, which is an ex-mining, ex-shipbuilding constituency in the northeast of England, where I felt embraced by the local community and determined to repay in all sorts of ways, but one way was continuing the tradition of this South Shields lecture. And, she's got an extraordinary story to tell, really, after 50 years in public life of some kind or another.
Does she want you to get back into politics?
She's not pushing that.
She'd be an interesting agent for you.
Agent? I would never put it that way. She's a friend.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us. And thank you so much for being with us. Until we meet again, take care and goodbye.